Two guardians, one waterway. There are places in the world where a single decision can change the lives of millions. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. At its narrowest point, this slim channel of water stretches only about 34 kilometers across. Yet every day, a massive share of the world's oil supply passes through it. What happens here doesn't stay here. A military confrontation in these waters can send energy prices soaring, disrupt global trade, and leave governments across the world scrambling to respond. Today, this narrow passage has become the center of one of the most dangerous geopolitical confrontations on the planet. It began with what many people dismissed as nothing more than an attention-grabbing remark. Earlier this year, during the opening weeks of the conflict between the United States and Iran, President Donald Trump posted an unexpected statement on social media. He suggested that the Strait of Hormuz should no longer carry its historic name. Instead, he proposed calling it the Strait of Trump. Most commentators laughed it off. News outlets treated it as another provocative headline designed to dominate the news cycle. Few believed the comment reflected actual policy, but history would prove otherwise. Months later, after fighting had continued far longer than expected, and a ceasefire had already begun to unravel, the same administration announced something far more consequential. Washington declared that the United States would assume responsibility for protecting the Strait of Hormuz. Alongside that announcement came another surprise: a proposal to collect a 20% toll from commercial cargo ships using the waterway under American protection, while military operations against Iranian targets resumed for a third consecutive night. Tehran answered almost immediately. Iran's foreign minister insisted that Iran had always safeguarded the strait and would continue doing so indefinitely. In an unexpected twist, he even appeared to respond to the proposed toll as though it were the opening offer in a negotiation, suggesting that 20% was excessive and promising Iran would be fair. Within hours, the argument had transformed into something much larger than a disagreement over shipping fees. Two governments, one strategic waterway, both insisting they were its rightful guardian. Between those competing claims lies one of the most important maritime corridors on Earth, a narrow passage carrying nearly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil. Every tanker entering these waters now faces not only military danger, but also a growing question: whose authority actually governs this route? To understand why the world has reached this point, we need to go back to the agreement that was supposed to prevent exactly this crisis. On June 17, 2026, representatives from the United States and Iran met in Switzerland and signed a memorandum intended to halt the fighting. The agreement established a complete ceasefire and created a 60-day diplomatic window to tackle the conflict's most difficult issues, including Iran's nuclear program. Under the deal, Iran pledged to guarantee safe passage for commercial vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz. In return, the United States agreed to begin easing sanctions and release frozen Iranian assets. On paper, it looked like a significant breakthrough. One section of the agreement focused specifically on the strait itself. It confirmed that commercial shipping should continue without unnecessary interference, and outlined plans for Iran and Oman to cooperate on managing the future administration of the waterway. But buried inside the agreement was a dangerous omission. The document never explained who had the final authority to determine which shipping lanes vessels were required to follow. It never clarified whether Iran could insist that cargo ships travel through routes monitored by the Revolutionary Guard instead of the internationally preferred channel closer to Oman's coastline. It also failed to answer equally important questions. Could either country charge transit fees? Who would settle disputes if ships refused to follow specific routes? And what exactly counted as safe passage once military forces from both sides remained active in the same waters? Those unanswered questions became the foundation of everything that followed. Although both governments signed the same document, they walked away, believing they had secured completely different agreements. That contradiction remained hidden until the first major test arrived. Only days after the ceasefire took effect, a Singapore-flagged cargo vessel attempted to leave the Strait of Hormuz using the shipping corridor near Oman's coast instead of the route preferred by Iranian authorities. Iranian forces claimed the vessel had violated the agreement by entering an unauthorized lane. Washington argued the opposite, insisting the ship had every legal right to use that route, and accusing Iran of violating the ceasefire. Both governments pointed to the exact same document. Both insisted their interpretation was the correct one. Neither side was willing to back down. What followed was almost inevitable. American forces responded with strikes against Iranian military positions. Iran retaliated. Within days, another tanker carrying millions of barrels of crude oil was struck inside the strait. More missile launches followed, more airstrikes, more retaliation. Weekend after weekend, the cycle repeated itself, each exchange larger than the last. Technically, the ceasefire still existed. In reality, it had already collapsed. not because either side officially abandoned it, but because both were enforcing completely different versions of the same agreement. And as commercial ships continued sailing through the world's most strategically important waterway, the conflict shifted from diplomatic disagreement to military confrontation, bringing the global economy along with it. Part 2. The weekend that pushed the region to the brink. If the ceasefire had been hanging by a thread, the following weekend was the moment that thread finally snapped. What unfolded over the next 72 hours wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a carefully escalating chain of military actions that fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. Every strike triggered another. Every response invited an even larger retaliation. By the time the dust settled, the crisis had expanded far beyond the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. The turning point came on July 12th. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that the Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed. According to Tehran, foreign vessels attempting to use shipping lanes that had not been authorized by Iranian authorities would no longer be allowed safe passage. Almost immediately, warning shots were fired at a commercial container ship sailing under the Cypriot flag. Iran described the action as an enforcement measure against a vessel using an unauthorized route. Washington described it as another direct attack on international shipping. Once again, the same event produced two completely different versions of reality. The consequences became visible almost immediately. One crew member disappeared during the confrontation. The crew aboard another commercial vessel had no choice but to abandon their ship altogether. For shipping companies watching from around the world, the message was unmistakable. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer just a tense maritime corridor. It had become an active battlefield. Despite Iran's declaration, President Trump publicly rejected the claim that the waterway had been closed. Speaking to the media, he insisted that commercial traffic remained open because American forces were ensuring freedom of navigation. In Washington's view, the United States was protecting international commerce. In Tehran's view, Iran was simply exercising its sovereign authority over waters adjacent to its own coastline. Two governments, two competing narratives, one narrow stretch of ocean where both insisted they were in control. Diplomatic language quickly gave way to military action. Within hours, U.S. Central Command launched one of its largest operations since the conflict began. Dozens upon dozens of Iranian military positions were targeted across the country's southern coastline. Explosions echoed through Bushehr province, home to one of Iran's most important nuclear facilities. Additional strikes were reported near Bandar Abbas, Keshem Island, Jask, Chabahar, Konarak, Abu Musa, and several other strategic coastal locations. These weren't isolated attacks on individual missile launchers or patrol boats. The campaign reached hundreds of kilometers along Iran's coastline. Military planners appeared focused on dismantling the infrastructure that allowed Iran to threaten shipping throughout the entire region. Radar installations, coastal missile batteries, drone launch facilities, naval bases, command centers. The objective was becoming increasingly clear, not simply protecting individual commercial vessels, but reducing Iran's ability to challenge control of the strait itself. President Trump made that objective even more explicit. He declared that the United States intended to control the Strait of Hormuz, and argued that Iranian military capabilities in the region were being systematically eliminated. The statement sent shockwaves through international capitals. Control of the world's most strategically important shipping lane had become an openly declared objective. Iran's response was swift and much broader than many analysts expected. Instead of limiting retaliation to the Strait of Hormuz, Iranian forces expanded the battlefield across the Gulf. Missiles and drones were launched toward military installations in Jordan. Additional attacks targeted Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain. Even the United Arab Emirates reported incoming missile and drone activity. Military bases hosting American personnel suddenly found themselves under direct threat. Iran claimed several operations had successfully struck command centers, drone facilities, fuel storage sites, missile defense systems, communications infrastructure, and weapons depots used by U.S. forces and their regional partners. Whether every claim was accurate mattered less than the larger picture. The conflict was no longer confined to two nations. Within a single weekend, military operations had spread across multiple countries, pulling nearly the entire Gulf region into the crisis. This was no longer simply a dispute over maritime navigation. It was becoming a regional war with global economic consequences. Meanwhile, commercial shipping companies faced impossible decisions. Every tanker captain entering the Strait of Hormuz now had to weigh the risk of missile attacks against the financial consequences of delaying delivery. Insurance costs climbed dramatically. Some vessels turned back before reaching the strait. Others remained anchored offshore, waiting for clarity that never came. Traffic through one of the world's busiest energy corridors began slowing at an alarming rate. The ceasefire technically remained on paper, but on the water, and in the skies above it, it no longer existed. The diplomatic agreement had been replaced by missiles, drones, airstrikes, and competing military operations. And the most dangerous phase of the conflict had only just begun. Then came another development that transformed the crisis from a military confrontation into a humanitarian tragedy. For the first time since the fighting resumed, civilian lives would be lost aboard commercial ships simply trying to pass through one of the world's busiest waterways. That single event would force governments across the globe to confront a difficult reality. This was no longer just a geopolitical struggle over influence. Ordinary people were now paying for it with their lives. Part 3, the toll that changed the conversation. Until this point, the conflict had been measured in missiles, drones, and military strikes. Then, for the first time, it claimed the life of someone who had nothing to do with the war. On Monday morning, 2 commercial oil tankers navigating the southern shipping lane near Oman's coastline came under missile attack. The vessels, carrying valuable energy cargo through one of the busiest maritime routes in the world, were struck while simply attempting to complete their voyage. The consequences were immediate. One crew member lost his life. Several others suffered serious injuries. Unlike soldiers operating on the front lines, these were civilian sailors, people hired to transport cargo across international waters. They weren't combatants. They weren't policymakers. Yet they became the first confirmed civilian casualties of the renewed fighting inside the Strait of Hormuz. The attacks sent shockwaves through the global shipping industry. Governments across the Gulf condemned the strikes, warning that targeting commercial vessels represented a dangerous escalation capable of destabilizing the entire region. The United Nations also voiced deep concern, pointing to a rapidly expanding conflict that now included attacks on civilian shipping, large-scale airstrikes, and military operations stretching across multiple countries at the same time. The crisis had reached a point where diplomacy was struggling to keep pace with events unfolding on the battlefield. But while the world focused on the deadly attacks, another announcement captured international attention. President Trump unveiled one of the most controversial proposals of the conflict. According to the plan, the United States would once again impose a naval blockade on Iranian ports, while introducing a 20% toll on commercial cargo passing through the Strait of Hormuz under American protection. The proposal came with a bold declaration. The United States, the president announced, would become the official guardian of the Strait of Hormuz. Supporters described the plan as a necessary security measure designed to protect one of the world's most important trade routes. Critics saw something entirely different. Within hours, Iran responded. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi rejected the claim that Washington had any authority over the waterway. He insisted that Iran had protected the strait for generations and would continue doing so. Yet, what surprised many observers wasn't the rejection itself. It was the tone. Rather than dismissing the toll outright, he appeared to respond as though the proposal were the opening offer in a negotiation. 20%, he suggested, was far too high. Iran, he implied, could offer something more reasonable. For many analysts, the exchange was extraordinary. While missiles were still being launched across the Gulf and military aircraft remained in the air, senior officials from both countries appeared to be debating transit fees for one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. But beyond the political theater lay an even larger contradiction. Only weeks earlier, senior American officials had strongly criticized any attempt to charge ships for using the Strait of Hormuz. Washington's position had been clear. International waterways should remain open to global commerce. No coastal nation, American officials argued, should demand payment simply for allowing vessels to pass through an international strait. That principle had served as one of the central justifications for challenging Iran's maritime policies throughout the conflict. Now, the United States appeared to be proposing its own version of exactly what it had previously condemned. Questions immediately followed. How was an American transit fee legally different from one imposed by Iran? Would every commercial vessel be required to pay? What would happen if shipping companies refused? Did such a policy comply with long-standing international maritime law governing freedom of navigation? Those questions received no immediate answers. Instead, the proposal handed Tehran a powerful diplomatic argument. Iranian officials could now claim that Washington had embraced the same concept it had spent months criticizing, only under a different flag. While public attention centered on military operations and political statements, another, quieter effort was unfolding behind closed doors. In Muscat, the capital of Oman, diplomats continued searching for a way to prevent the crisis from spiraling even further. Oman had long maintained communication with both Washington and Tehran, making it one of the few governments trusted by each side. Its latest proposal focused on a practical compromise. Instead of forcing every vessel into a single disputed corridor, officials explored the possibility of recognizing 2 internationally managed shipping routes, one closer to Iran's coastline and another near Oman. The idea was simple. Allow both countries to play a role in overseeing maritime traffic while giving commercial shipping companies greater flexibility and reducing opportunities for confrontation. On paper, it offered a potential path away from conflict. In practice, implementing such a system would be extraordinarily complicated. International maritime law limits the ability of coastal states to charge transit fees or interfere with innocent passage through strategic waterways. Any new arrangement would require careful legal language, capable of satisfying both governments without violating established international rules. Political obstacles proved even more difficult. Iran accused the United States of attempting to pressure Oman behind the scenes to block any agreement that strengthened Tehran's influence. Whether those accusations were accurate remained uncertain, but the result was unmistakable. The diplomatic process became almost as contested as the strait itself. Even so, Oman remained one of the last active channels for dialogue. While military commanders planned new operations and political leaders exchanged increasingly confrontational statements, Omani negotiators continued searching for a formula that could give both sides enough political cover to step back from the edge. And whether that effort would succeed, or collapse under the weight of the fighting, would soon determine whether the region moved toward negotiation or a far wider war. Part 4. The Strait that holds the world. Hostage beyond the political speeches and diplomatic headlines, the battlefield itself has been evolving at remarkable speed. This conflict is no longer being fought solely with fighter jets, destroyers, or conventional missile systems. A new generation of warfare has quietly entered the Strait of Hormuz, transforming one of the world's most strategically important waterways into a testing ground for modern military technology. Recent operations have revealed the growing use of autonomous attack systems, alongside traditional air and naval forces. These unmanned platforms are capable of operating in dangerous coastal waters without risking human crews, allowing military commanders to strike targets with greater flexibility and at a fraction of the cost of conventional vessels. For years, Iran's Revolutionary Guard built its naval strategy around speed, numbers, and geography. Its fleet of fast attack boats was designed to exploit the narrow waters of the strait, where larger warships have less room to maneuver. But autonomous sea drones are beginning to change that equation. Unlike conventional patrol ships, they can remain in contested waters for extended periods, track hostile vessels, and launch precision attacks without exposing sailors to danger. In many ways, they represent the maritime version of the drone revolution that has already reshaped modern air warfare. While military technology continues to evolve, the commercial world has been forced to react just as quickly. Shipping traffic through the strait has fallen dramatically. Many cargo vessels now delay their journeys or wait offshore until security conditions become clearer. Others are rerouting entirely, accepting higher transportation costs rather than risking missile attacks inside the Gulf. Insurance premiums for commercial shipping have surged. Freight rates have climbed. Energy companies are rewriting delivery schedules almost daily. And global financial markets are responding exactly as expected. Oil prices have risen sharply as traders attempt to calculate the risk of prolonged instability. The concern extends far beyond the Middle East. Nearly 1/5 of the world's seaborne oil supply depends on uninterrupted movement through this single waterway. Any sustained disruption has consequences for manufacturing, transportation, electricity generation, and household fuel prices across continents. Every missile launched inside the strait carries economic consequences thousands of kilometers away. Yet, despite the mounting costs, neither side appears capable of taking a meaningful step backward. For Iran, the struggle has grown into far more than a dispute over shipping lanes. Control of the strait represents one of the country's remaining strategic advantages. Maintaining influence over this waterway reinforces both national prestige and the authority of powerful military institutions that have shaped Iranian regional policy for decades. Abandoning those claims without securing visible concessions would carry serious political consequences inside Iran itself. For the United States, the situation is equally complicated. Washington has invested enormous political and military credibility in guaranteeing freedom of navigation through the strait. Public declarations about protecting commercial shipping, expanding military operations, and assuming responsibility for regional security have raised expectations both at home and among allied nations. Backing away without tangible results would risk appearing weak after months of increasingly forceful commitments. That creates a dangerous strategic trap. Both governments have publicly promised outcomes that leave very little room for compromise. Neither leadership wants to appear to retreat, and history has repeatedly shown that conflicts become most dangerous when political promises leave diplomacy with nowhere to go. Looking ahead, 3 possible paths now stand before the region. The first is continued escalation. Military strikes intensify, retaliatory attacks spread even further across the Gulf. Commercial shipping suffers additional losses. Oil prices continue climbing. The ceasefire disappears completely, replaced by a prolonged regional conflict involving multiple countries and growing international involvement. The second possibility is something less dramatic, but far from peaceful. Rather than ending the conflict, both sides settle into a tense military standoff. Limited strikes continue. Commercial traffic resumes only partially. Diplomatic negotiations remain alive but produce few meaningful breakthroughs. The strait stays open yet never truly secure. This scenario avoids full-scale war while preserving the conditions for future confrontation. The third possibility is the one diplomats continue hoping for. Negotiators succeed in building a practical framework that satisfies enough of each side's demands to prevent further escalation. Disagreements over shipping routes, maritime security, and commercial administration are gradually replaced with negotiated procedures. Sanctions begin easing. Diplomatic dialogue resumes. The crisis slowly shifts from the battlefield back into conference rooms. Whether that outcome remains achievable depends largely on decisions being made right now behind closed doors. But while governments debate strategy and military planners calculate their next moves, there is another side to this conflict that receives far less attention: the human side. Thousands of civilian mariners remain caught in the middle. These crews come from countries across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. They are engineers, mechanics, electricians, deck officers, ordinary men and women whose only responsibility is moving cargo safely from one port to another. They are not shaping foreign policy. They are not deciding military strategy. Yet every time they enter the Strait of Hormuz, they place themselves directly between competing warships, missile batteries, and armed drones. For them, every voyage has become a gamble. Some wait aboard anchored vessels for days. Others continue sailing despite the risks because international trade cannot simply stop. The sailor who lost his life aboard one of the attacked tankers became more than another casualty in a geopolitical crisis. He became a reminder that behind every strategic calculation are ordinary people, whose names rarely appear in history books. Their families bear the cost long after governments issue new statements and military briefings fade from the headlines. As the world watches the Strait of Hormuz, one reality has become impossible to ignore. The ceasefire that once promised stability has largely collapsed under competing interpretations. Military operations continue. Diplomatic negotiations struggle to keep pace. Global markets remain on edge, and the question of who truly controls this narrow passage remains unanswered. Perhaps the greatest irony is that both Washington and Tehran insist they are acting to preserve security. Yet every new operation seems to make the strait more dangerous than it was the day before. History has always viewed the Strait of Hormuz as one of the world's most important choke points. Today, it has become something even more significant, a symbol of how a narrow stretch of water can shape the balance of global power. Whether the coming weeks bring diplomacy or deeper conflict will depend on choices that have yet to be made. If negotiations succeed, the strait may once again become simply a shipping route connecting nations. If they fail, this narrow corridor could become the center of a much larger regional war, one whose consequences would reach far beyond the Middle East. Because when nearly 20% of the world's seaborne oil flows through just a few kilometers of contested water, every decision made, there echoes across the globe. And until a lasting solution is found, the Strait of Hormuz will remain more than a waterway. It will remain one of the most dangerous places on Earth.